Well, welcome all to this MIT Club event. We have Dr. Pat Brown here, founder and CEO of Impossible Foods. So I actually want to start. My name is Suds Jain, by the way, and I received my bachelor's and master's from MIT. I was very alarmed by climate change, and so I became a volunteer with this Energy and Environment series at MIT. And I've been following the development of plant-based proteins for quite some time. And I've eaten several Impossible burgers, and I'm very pleased that Pat accepted our invitation to come speak to us. He's very busy, very hard to get a hold of. Fortunately, we have a mutual friend, and I was able to get him that way. So I want to start with a poll first. Dr. Brown is a scientist, and there are a bunch of MIT people here, so we like data. So 2 questions. For how many of you was this the first time you had an Impossible burger? Quite a few, okay. And how many of you think this burger is as good as a beef burger? Not as many, but quite a few. Very good. So Pat Brown received his bachelor's, MD, and PhD, all from the University of Chicago. He did a 3-year residency in pediatrics when he decided he wanted to do basic research so he could have a greater impact. So then he did a 3-year postdoc at UCSF, and after that he joined the faculty of Stanford in 1988. At UCSF, he discovered the mechanism by which HIV inserts genes into human cells. In the early 1990s, he invented DNA microarrays at Stanford. He's the co-founder of the Public Library of Science, PLOS. He was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2002, and he's won the Medal of Honor, at maybe sometime, the Medal of Honor at the American Cancer Society. So welcome, Dr. Brown.
Thank you.
So after 20 years at Stanford, you took an 18-month sabbatical in 2009 to figure out what you wanted to do next. Mm-hmm. And you wanted to work on the most important problem in the world. So how did you decide what that was, and how did you decide you were the right guy?
Oh, okay. Two good questions. So how I decided this was the most important problem was relatively easy to find out. I was kind of embarrassed that I wasn't actually aware of it, at least the magnitude of the problem, until I deliberately started looking into it, which was during my sabbatical. And I should have known. But I didn't discover this. It's actually been widely known. There was even a study published in about 2010 by the UN Environmental Program that came to the conclusion that so they did a study where they looked at pretty much globally at all the major sort of industrial sectors and technologies, and they came to the conclusion that this category called animal products, basically the use of animals as technology to produce food, was by a huge margin had the biggest aggregate destructive environmental impact. And it was for a great number of reasons, which I'd be happy to go through, but I don't want to bore everyone unless you're interested. But it's it's a huge greenhouse gas source. It's by far the biggest user of land of any industry or any human activity. If you take every building, every road, every paved surface on Earth and put them all together, it adds up to about 0.5% of Earth's surface. And but the land that we're using, either growing feed crops or grazing livestock, adds up to about 45% of Earth's land area. And that's all land that would otherwise, since we don't need it that much for habitation, would otherwise be providing, supporting biodiversity, providing habitat for wildlife, providing ecosystem services and so forth. This industry is the biggest user and polluter of water of any industry, and I could go on and on. But anyway, the point was, when I realized that, I felt like, okay, this is the problem I have to solve. And why me? Well, no one else was doing it. And that's the simple answer. That, and I feel like it's actually something that I tell students all the time, is that, you know, a lot of times people will just sort of figure, here's some big problem. It could be a big scientific problem or a big global problem or whatever. And a lot of people naturally think, well, you know, it's not for me. It's not my job to solve this problem. But everybody's thinking that. And you know, the thing to, if no one else is solving it, if you're saying it's not my responsibility, the UN should do it, or, you know, the US government should do it, or whatever. Well, they're not doing it, and therefore it's our responsibility. It's my responsibility. And so anyway, that's why I figured I was going to do it. And also I felt like, you know, as soon as I looked at it, I realized, actually, this is a hard problem, but it's far from the hardest problem to solve. It's a lot easier, I think, from a technical standpoint, than a lot of things that are being considered to address big environmental problems, and the impact you could have on all sorts of environmental problems, climate change. It's not just you know, eliminating the greenhouse gas associated with this industry. If you can recover 45% of Earth's land area, where the total amount of biomass on that land area differs from the biomass that was there 200 years ago by the carbon equivalent of 15 years worth of fossil fuel emissions at current, you know, at the current rate. Simply allowing that biomass to reaccumulate, which it can do, actually pretty much left its own devices, you could actually turn back the clock on atmospheric CO2 levels just by allowing photosynthesis to fix carbon. And that is a very realistic possibility. Sorry, I'm going on a bit of a rant here, but anyway, the point is that the benefits of doing that are so huge, and really the problem to solve just comes down to, so when I first decided to take on this problem, I thought, okay, here's what I'm going to do. The stupidest possible idea I could have had, and I'm kicking myself that I wasted a few months on this, was I thought, okay, great. What I'm going to do is this academic thing. I'm going to organize a bunch of people who are objective experts and don't have a conflict of interest to do a study looking at the economic, environmental, food security, and public health impacts, what they would be if we were to replace animals in the food system by plant-based foods. So I organized a National Research Council workshop on the topic, and I thought, and it was interesting, but it eventually dawned on me, this is ridiculous, because, you know, NRC reports are basically, you know, they get sent to everyone in Congress. I don't think they ever read them. You know, they just gather dust. No offense to people who are in the NRC, but I think that really is what happens. I mean, I'm in the NRC, so I can't, you know, I'm dissing myself here. But anyway, and, you know, you're going to maybe move the needle a millimeter at best. Whereas if you could do this really simple thing, which is, you know, first of all, recognize the fact that you're not going to persuade people to change their diets. That is just, forget about it. When I was at the climate conference in Paris 2 years ago, one of the most remarkable things that I saw there was that here you have this gathering of some of the most knowledgeable and dedicated environmentalists in the world, okay, who knew more about the problem than I did when I started out, okay. They were fully aware of by and large, the impact of you know, animal food, animals as technology on the environment. Every single one of them, as far as I could tell, went out and had a steak for dinner. And the point is, and it's not that they're bad guys at all, you know. They're really trying to do their best, but it just emphasizes the point that really good people who understand the problem, nevertheless, find it impossible to give up something that's such an important source of pleasure in their lives. And that's true for billions of people, which basically means that we have to keep producing foods to meet the demand. We just have to find a better way to produce them. And I felt like, as a biochemist, that's the kind of problem. I didn't know how I was going to solve it, but that's the kind of problem that you just know this is a solvable problem. You just have to go and do it. So
during your sabbatical, you sort of had this realization that heme was the key to the flavor of meat, apparently. And so you started slicing the roots of clover plants and soy plants, and I guess eventually you decided that you had to genetically modify a yeast. And I know the video talked about heme a little bit, but can you explain why you believe that heme is the key?
Oh, sure. Well, there's why I suspect it in the first place, and then why I believe it. Well, we have abundant evidence that it's true, but I suspected it because heme. So heme is this molecule. I think probably most people here know heme, and I apologize for telling you stuff you already know, but it's one of the most ubiquitous molecules in life on Earth. Every single plant and animal cell has heme, and it's the molecule. I would say, almost without qualification, if you're a living cell and you are benefiting from oxygen in the atmosphere, you're using heme to gain that benefit. So, for example, in your bloodstream, the molecule that carries oxygen from your lungs to your tissues is heme, in hemoglobin in your red blood cells. Then when you are in your mitochondria, let's say, in your cells, when you're burning calories to produce energy to keep the cells alive, that system is completely dependent on heme. And your life is so dependent on it that basically the reason that cyanide or carbon monoxide will kill you in minutes is entirely because they bind to heme and they block its activity. So heme is this incredibly important molecule, and every plant needs it just as much as every animal needs it. So the thing about meat, though, is that animal tissues, unlike compared to plant tissues, depend on respiration. They generate energy. They need a lot more energy. They need to produce a lot more energy. And that uses oxygen, and that means they just need a lot more heme for all the kinds of goings on with oxygen, binding it, delivering it to tissues, storing it, and stuff like that. And so all the things that we call meat have hundreds to thousands times higher levels of heme than plant tissues, virtually any plant tissues, with rare exceptions. And so that I was aware of. And I was also aware of this, and everyone who's a biochemist has known this forever. I didn't discover any of this. That heme is a great catalyst. It's one of the best catalysts in nature. And because of that, for example, the enzymes in your liver that metabolize drugs and toxins and so forth use heme as the catalytic element. Okay, so those are two facts. So one of the questions that I started thinking about right away when I thought, okay, we gotta figure out how to do this is we need to understand how meat works the same way that we might want to understand how does a cell work, how does a gene work, what are the molecular mechanisms that cause a normal cell to become a cancer cell, that kind of stuff. We need to understand in the same kind of mechanistic level how meat produces flavor and what underlies the texture and so forth. And when you were thinking about that, when I was thinking about that question, and there is something magical about the flavor of meat. I mean, it is categorically different from anything from a plant. And particularly, I was thinking about, during the cooking process, there's a point in the cooking process where you have this explosion of flavor and aroma that were not there in the raw burger to begin with. but a completely different set of compounds is produced, de novo, in a matter of seconds, basically, during the cooking process. That, to me, smelled like, okay, there's a catalyst there. And the hypothesis was that this protein in your muscle tissue, myosin, which is a heme protein, it binds heme and kind of, you need a protein to bind heme in living cells because it's not very water soluble, and also you have to kind of control its oxygen binding and catalytic activity. So there's this protein myosin that binds heme. It's what, not myosin, myoglobin, that it's the abundance of that protein that's what makes your muscles red, that makes meat red, and so forth. That the hypothesis was that that kind of explosion of chemistry is triggered when the myoglobin protein unfolds. So when you get high enough temperature, the protein loses its folded structure, and the heme that's until then been kind of buried is kind of set loose. And anyway, so that was just a hypothesis at the time. The thing about the clovers was, well, it was December, and I thought, okay, I sort of remember that the root nodules of legumes have a lot of this protein called leg hemoglobin, which is one of the rare cases of a plant having a lot of high concentration of heme. And but I just read about it, like way back in the day in textbooks and so forth. So I just thought, okay, I'm just going to check to see whether there might be a useful amount of heme in there. Clover is a legume, and it was the only legume that I could, within walking distance of my my house on Stanford campus. And so I just pulled up a bunch of clover plants, and on the roots, these root nodules, which do nitrogen fixation, minuscule little things the size of a sesame seed. But anyway, I gathered up a bunch of clover plants and cut them all open. And the cool thing about these things is that during the active growth of the plants, the root nodules have so much leg hemoglobin that they look like a freshly cut steak when you cut them open. And so that was kind of an epiphany to me. And then I did some calculations, and I calculated that the amount of leg hemoglobin in the root nodules of the soybean plants grown in the U.S. was equivalent to the amount of myoglobin in all the meat consumed in the U.S. So I had what turned out to be a really bad idea, that we'll just harvest the root nodules of all these soybean plants, and that's how we're going to get, almost for free, we'll get all the myoglobin we need. What I hadn't considered, not having gone to engineering school at MIT or anywhere else, was that it's not trivial to just magically make that happen. And so we spent months, like after I founded the company, we spent kind of ridiculous amount of our precious time and resources in soybean farms creating these contraptions to to get the root nodules and strip them off the roots and get rid of the dirt and the rocks and all this kind of crap. And eventually we realized that it was just going to be ridiculous, that it was never going to be cost effective doing it that way. And besides which, when you're digging up the soil, you're releasing carbon that's stored in carbonates, and so you're actually contributing to global warming and erosion and all this kind of stuff. So eventually I came to my senses, and I realized that we had to find another way. And the simplest way is just, there are other ways we're working on, but the simplest immediately that we could do right away was just take the gene for leg hemoglobin, which turned out to be, for food purposes, a better heme protein than the one that's naturally present in meat, myoglobin, which just incidentally, cows did not evolve to be great meat machines, and they didn't evolve to be optimal for making delicious meat. And so it turns out that, for example, myoglobin, the heme in myoglobin oxidizes quite readily, which is why your meat turns brown on the shelf and so forth. And leg hemoglobin oxidizes much more slowly. So, your meat, so to speak, stays pink longer, and there are other advantages to it. So anyway, we took the gene for that particular heme protein, put it in yeast. We have an amazing team that does the strain development, and they got this yeast, and there was a lot of really clever work involved, to be so good at producing leg hemoglobin that more than 70% of all the protein in the cell is leg hemoglobin. So it's just like pretty much made of leg hemoglobin, which is quite a feat, and that's how we produce it. Yeah.
So during your sabbatical, you came up with this idea of heme. Then you get on your bicycle, and you ride up Sandville Road to Coastal Ventures, and you walk out of there with $7 million.
Yeah, big suitcase full of cash.
So what was your business plan like? I mean, what did you tell them?
So, yeah, first of all, you know, one of the, and I mean this seriously, one of the just like incredibly fortuitous advantages I had was that just by the chance that I live where I live on Stanford campus, you know, probably half of all the venture capital money in the world is within a mile radius, and that is just like sheer luck that that was true. My business plan, well, so I've never had any interest in being business. I founded this nonprofit, which is a business, and it's kind of a profitable nonprofit, but I don't see any of the money. We just plow it back into the business. But that's the closest I've ever come to being in business. And literally, I had no interest in business. Like, I just felt like, why does anyone ever do this? Like whenever my colleagues go start companies, I'm thinking, you have the best job in the world, you know. Why would you give that up, you know, to spend time being in business? Anyway, well, I mean, that was just the way I felt. So, so I was a complete neophyte, and I went in there and I basically said, okay, so here's the deal. You know, there's this horrible ongoing environmental disaster. The demand for these foods is going up 70% in the next 30 years, and it's already a disaster, and it's just going to turn into a complete catastrophe. We have to solve it. I have an idea about how to solve it. It's a half, you know, I mean, it was just an idea. None of it had really been tested. You know, and I think that if we could do this, it would be successful as a business. And then, oh, by the way, like my last slide is, it's a $1.5 trillion global market that by 2030 will be $3 trillion that is currently dependent on a prehistoric technology that's manifestly incredibly less efficient than it could be, and blah, 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 which is, in retrospect, I realized that that was the only slide I needed, probably the only one they paid any attention to. And now, when I've subsequently gone out to ask for money, that slide has moved its way all the way pretty much to the front of the deck. But anyway, so I was, you know, so they thought at least that it was credible enough to do that. And the business plan, it was not that different from what we've actually done, except that we thought that we would be where we are today in about 3 years, and it's been 6 years. So, you know, just, yeah.
Okay. So you have a very ambitious goal. You claim that you plan to replace all animal-based protein by 2035.
Yeah, I would say we intend to, our mission is to completely replace animals as a food production technology by 2035. And that's not just like BS. That is the thing we start with all our strategic planning, and we are dead serious about it. I think it's completely doable. You know, there have been other technologies that have, in fact, you know, that have replaced long-standing incumbent technologies on a time scale of, you know, 1 or 2 decades. so the reason I think this is plausible is it's a technology problem, and once we solve it, we have such a huge advantage over the incumbent technology in terms of our ability to, when our product is just as good as the best product from a cow, the next day it can be better. It's just like with motorized transportation. You know, the first motorized transportation, land transportation that was commercialized was a locomotive, and in 1830, I believe, there was a famous race between that locomotive and a horse, and the locomotive lost, barely. But the horse never got any faster, and the motorized transportation was continuously improvable in almost every possible axis. And so that's why, you know, this year it's better than it was last year, and in 20 years it'll be better than it was today. And the same is true with the technology that we're developing, is that we have the same degree of control over flavor, texture, nutrition, cost, and all sorts of stuff that we can use to make such an overwhelming advantage in terms of consumer value that I think that will happen. I don't intend for Impossible Foods to own that entire market. Obviously, in order to scale at the rate we have to do, a lot of this is going to have to be through enabling other people and so forth, but developing the technology. But I think it's completely doable.
So I see that there's 4 axes you could be working on. One is environment, one is health, one is animal welfare, and one is taste and flavor. You seem to be really focused on taste and flavor. Why is that?
Well, first of all, it's not the environmental benefits. So the burger that we're making now, as of a year and a half ago, and it's gotten better since then, but we haven't redone it. We did a life cycle analysis. Producing it generates 1/8 the greenhouse gas emissions. It uses 1/4 the water and less than 1/20th the land that's involved in producing the same thing from a cow. And that was completely independently done life cycle analysis. So from a sustainability standpoint, this is, you know, we're thinking ahead in all sorts of ways about how to, you know, with our supply chain, everything else, how to minimize the environmental footprint. So that's a huge part of our thinking. It's baked into all our planning and so forth. So is cost. If we don't see a route to at scale being substantially cheaper than the incumbent product, then you know, we're not going to pursue that, because basically it's critical to our success. But the reason we focus so much on flavor and texture and deliciousness is, from a consumer standpoint, that's the non-negotiable part when it comes to food. If it doesn't deliver, the reason people are so addicted to these foods is because of the sensory pleasures they get from them. That's it. And so that means that unless we can deliver on that, you know, the rest is irrelevant. And that's the hardest part too. I mean, like you know, you could cost-wise and you know, environmental impact-wise, you could take any number of already available at scale plant proteins that have been have been a supply chain forever, and meet all the protein requirements, or actually match the protein content and the essential amino acid content, and from a nutritional standpoint, match the cheapest available meat for less than 1/25th of the cost. So the economics are so tilted in our favor to begin with, it's almost like, unless we deliberately screw it up, that, you know, and just make really bad decisions, that's not a very hard part, okay? The sustainability part isn't very hard, because you're talking about the most insanely resource-intensive and destructive technology on Earth. You would absolutely have to be trying really hard to be remotely as bad. So I feel like that's something that we want to minimize our environmental impact, but that is relatively trivial to achieve. What's not trivial to achieve and really required a lot of really hard science and is still, the biggest scientific focus is how to deliver and out-deliver the sensory pleasures that we get from meat. And that's the reason we focus so hard on it, because the rest is much easier. It's easy, pretty much. And that's the one thing we have to crack, and then the rest follows.
So is the Impossible Burger healthier than a beef burger?
So what I would say is that, so first of all, one of our absolute principles of the company is that we're never going to make any product that we don't believe is substantially healthier than what it replaces. So that's a principle. And we have made, and as many people know, there are known pretty well established by sort of population-based studies health risks associated with meat consumption and so forth that plant-based foods don't share. And a lot of the things that we design into our product eliminate features of animal meat that are associated with health problems. For example, when you produce ground beef the way it's produced now with a cow, it's done in like the absolute opposite of what you would want a food production facility to be like. It's basically a room that contains aerosolized fecal matter. And as a result, literally there was a study published 2 years ago that looked at 300 samples of ground beef from supermarkets, and out of 300 samples that they looked at from 100 supermarkets, 300 of them contained fecal bacteria. So that's an easy one to solve. But the reason that answering that question is hard is because as a scientist, I can say that based on what I know, I feel like there's strong reason a priori to think that this is a healthier product than meat. And I'm internally essentially convinced. But what I would need to be able to say that with absolute certainty is to do a clinical study and basically say, okay, I'm going to take a bunch of people, control for as much as I can control, and these ones will eat our product and these ones will eat the cow product, and we'll actually measure the health outcome. Everything else is kind of a surrogate. And but all I can say is based on what we know about all that kind of like surrogate information that is relevant to health, I personally have high confidence that it's substantially healthier.
So you tried to match all of the minerals and vitamins, and you in fact added more, I think, niacin and vitamin B12 than what you call 80-20 meat, right? 80% lean, 20% fat.
Which is the kind of middle-of-the-road, mainstream ground beef composition in the U.S., yeah.
So you've matched the protein and the fat and the vitamins.
And the iron and the bioavailable. So heme iron is the most bioavailable form. That's why people erroneously, but nevertheless, will say, oh, if you're iron deficient, you should eat more meat. But the heme in our burger, the iron in our burger is heme iron. It's the same. It's the most bioavailable form of iron, and the iron content's the same too. So, yeah.
So in August 2017, the FDA said Impossible hadn't demonstrated the safety of genetically modified heme from leg hemoglobin. So tell us about FDA regulations in the U.S. and Europe and why you can even sell this burger.
Okay, well that's actually a very interesting and sort of complicated story that unfortunately a lot of it has to do with arcane regulatory stuff, but I'll go through it anyway. So the way that FDA regulates food is it's largely voluntary. in the sense that you can introduce a new food on the market. You don't have to tell the FDA. The situation you're in is the FDA has the authority to tell you to take it off the market if they think it's unsafe. They virtually never do. I mean, there's all kinds of very well-known, incredibly nasty things that are on the market that you know, you can find in your local health food store or whatever. But there's a process. But we felt like, okay, we're not going to just fly under the radar. First of all, even if we wanted to fly under the radar, it would be impossible given the stuff that we're doing. So we started talking to the FDA about 4 or 5 years ago, just telling them what we were doing and basically what our plans were and so forth. And we began working on, so there's a process. So the one thing you can do, if you're a new food ingredient, you don't need FDA approval. There is no approval process. Literally doesn't exist. But there, you can have that ingredient evaluated for its safety and have independent experts and so forth evaluate it and find that it is generally recognized as safe, meaning that a review of all the information and scientific literature on this subject supports the finding that it's safe. So we did that in 2014. We didn't do it because the thing that was being evaluated, like hemoglobin, is basically heme, which has been part of the human diet since humans existed and long before, and the heme in our product is exactly identical to that heme. So heme is not the issue. And then it's wrapped in a protein that is a plant protein that's not previously been at least widely consumed. Now, in your diet, there are thousands of heme proteins that you consume in any given week because there are so many different kinds of heme proteins in plants, and you have hundreds of different kinds of heme proteins in your body, and so forth. None of them have ever been found to have any toxicity or allergenicity problems. So when we did a thorough survey of the literature and some in vitro experimental stuff, we felt like, okay, we had adequately shown that that this protein is safe. And we gave it to a bunch of independent food safety experts, and they agreed with that. When we gave it to the FDA, they didn't think it was unsafe, but they said, and actually, well, all the conversations with the FDA are sort of confidential, so I can't give you all the color, but basically, they effectively urged us to do a toxicology study using rats. And they asked us to do a different kind of allergenicity analysis that was computational, that was completely ridiculous, but we did it anyway. It was completely ridiculous because this is a method where the authors who published it applied it to a huge collection of proteins whose sequences were known, and found that 50% of every known protein sequence is predicted to be allergenic by their algorithm, which means it's just completely useless. But anyway, we used that algorithm and it's fine. But it was stupid. That's why we hadn't used it to begin with, because I thought, I mean, if you have an algorithm that has virtually 100% false positive rate, I mean, what's the point? But anyway, but we did that, and then we did the rat toxicology studies, and then we resubmitted all the previous evidence plus this additional evidence now about 4 months ago. And I would say, based on all our conversations, you never know until you're there, we're highly confident that the FDA will review that stuff. And what they do is, if they decide that you have made the persuasive case, they won't approve it. They'll just say, we have no questions. So that's kind of the definition, the closest thing you come to having a new ingredient approved. And we're hoping to get that no questions letter in a couple of months. And I would say we're highly confident just based on the data. But anyway, that's, I'm sorry, it's very arcane. That's the food safety approval process.
Is Europe worse?
What's that?
Is Europe worse?
Europe worse. Well, it depends. I don't want to make a value judgment. I'll say that Europe has a relatively similar process, but the kinds of data they generally expect you to provide are more onerous. Yeah. But I mean, you know, we'll do it if we have to.
So there's another approach to eliminating animals from creating these proteins. It's called clean meat. And that's lab-grown cow cells. I know you have opinions about that. How does that compete with what you're doing?
Well, I generally don't like to get drawn into discussions of this just because I have to be honest because I'm a scientist, but I just rather not get into it. But basically, but whatever. So I feel like the people who are trying to promote that, I feel like have the best motives, and I think that if I thought they had even the most remote chance of success, I would be their biggest fan. But because I actually know quite a lot about cell culture, I did a lot of my research for 25 years at Stanford, and even before that used cell culture. And I know that a lot is involved there. I can say with almost absolute certainty that, well, I could say, I mean, I should never say anything is absolutely certain. This is about as close as you can possibly get. That there's no conceivable way where you could do it that's remotely cost competitive. And I'll just give you two kind of sort of analogies. So one thing is, imagine I were to say that the way we're going to make meat from now on is we're going to harvest a fetal calf, and we're going to wipe out its immune system, okay? And then we're going to feed it intravenously for its entire life. We're going to put it in the ICU and feed it intravenously for its entire life. So we have to provide all its food in a highly purified form. We have to, we are its immune system, because a single virus touches that stuff and it's wiped out. And everything, its entire homeostatic system, okay? Anyway, so we take this calf, we put it in the ICU, and that's how we raise it. That would be way easier than growing that calf from stem cells and then still having to basically take care of every single of its survival needs as if it was in the ICU. It's completely, and there's many, I could go into more details about this. The economics just don't even come remotely close to working. But I would be their biggest fan if they could make it succeed. So I'm not dissing their efforts at all. It's just that I just feel like no friggin' way. And another thing about it is that I think if you think back 200 years ago, the analogous thing would be someone decides, okay, well, actually, you know, horses are a real problem, and we have to figure out a way to make carts move without horses. So here's our genius idea. We're going to take stem cells from horses, and we're going to, you know, hook them up to gears and pulleys and so forth so that they can move the car, okay? It's pretty much the analogous thing, because you're locked into the notion that the only way, because 200 years ago, the only way you can make the cart move with a horse. So if you say, no, well, maybe you don't need the whole horse. Maybe you can do it with just the cells. You're still locked into the idea that somehow it has to involve a horse. And it's the same way with this, that you're locked into the idea that the only way you can make something that delivers what meat delivers somehow has to involve animal cells, which is just as ridiculous.
So you said that the meat industry is a $1.5 trillion business.
Meat, fish, and dairy.
Meat, fish, and dairy. They're not going
Meat
to
is
go
all
down
about
without a
that.
fight. So they have very big lobbyists.
Mhm.
They're a big industry. Have you seen any opposition from them or any roadblocks they put in your way?
I'd say that there's been very little overt, very little that's overt that's been done against us. We have very, I would say, absolutely direct knowledge that they are committed to sparing no expense to make us go away. But it's not that I'm not worried about it. I feel like it's going to happen, and just bring it on, because the huge advantage we have is that all we're asking from, let's say, the government and the public is just give us no advantages and just give us a chance to compete in the market, okay? And that's on us. If we don't do a better job of delivering what consumers want, then you got nothing to worry about. And if we do, then consumers have the right to get the products they prefer. And it's not appropriate for government or anyone else to stand in the way. And so I feel like we have, I think sort of from a political point of view, it's very hard to make the case that you're doing the public any favors by giving unfair advantages to some industry or trying to thwart a new product that consumers demand. But yeah, anyway, so we haven't seen a lot of, we're aware of various things. We have our moles and stuff like that, but so far nothing really overt.
So Google Ventures offered you $300 million for your company. You turned them down. What's your exit strategy?
Well, first of all, that's a rumor. But I can say that we have been very clear, I've been very clear, and our investors are well aware of this, that we have zero interest and will do everything we can to prevent being acquired by anyone, no matter how well-intentioned, that we are not absolutely certain has at least as much commitment to our mission and just as unshakable as we do. And since there is no such company, you can draw your own conclusions there. But and as far as exit strategy, well, I think, and I do feel a responsibility to our investors, because I feel like our venture investors and other investors, they're representing people whose pensions depend on their being successful and stuff like that. It's not like it's just a bunch of evil, greedy people trying to fill their pockets, although they are trying to fill their pockets, but also, provide returns to their own investors. So I take that seriously, and basically I think it's a highly unlikely scenario that this company would ever be acquired, because I just feel like that, it's hard to see how that would be helpful to our mission. But I think there's a reasonably good likelihood that the company will eventually go public, and at that point our investors can do whatever they want. And I think it's a reasonably good likelihood because as we grow, we're going to need to have access to capital to just do the building we need to do and so forth. And it's going to be virtually impossible to do that at scale without eventually going public. I'm not in any great hurry to do that. I mean, I want to do the right thing by our investors and by our employees that own shares and so forth. But I feel like everybody will come out well if we do our job right and maximize success of our mission. They're going to be fine financially.
So these burgers we served today cost us $15 a piece. And
They
you
did.
can get a $3.50 burger from Safeway or wherever.
Mm-hmm.
So when do we expect a $3.50 Impossible burger?
Well, first of all, the price you could pay for an Impossible Burger varies greatly depending on the store that sells it. It's that price because the people that sell it, that's essentially the same price they charge for a burger made from a cow. So, and there are places right now where you can buy an Impossible Burger with, you know, the fixings for $5.99, and I can say that in terms of our economics that we can't afford to lose money when we sell our product to restaurants. And they can't afford to lose money when they sell it to their consumers. So you can draw your own conclusions, but basically the economics are already pretty good. And our goal is sometime within the next few years, and I can't really give you a time because it just depends on a lot of things. A lot of it involves just getting to a sufficient scale, but is to be price competitive with the most mass market ground beef. And the same is true with the subsequent meat, you know, the subsequent products that we're building. Is that it's really it's just a novelty if it's not priced to be a mass market product, and we wouldn't be wasting our time if we didn't have a trajectory to do that.
So where can people get these burgers?
As of a couple of weeks ago, there's 700 restaurants all over the U.S. that are serving them. In November, it was 40 restaurants. So we're scaling up really rapidly, and there's going to be probably, you know, by the end of the month there'll be hundreds more around here. I don't even know all the places that serve them. And actually, here's a funny thing. There's a black market. I'm not kidding. We just found the third case of this where there's a restaurant in Woodside that serves it, Bucks, and a nearby grocery store was found selling it for $20 a pound in their frozen or in their meat counter, which was, we told them, don't do that, please, because for a lot of reasons. First of all, we lose all quality control. So I mean, just like if there's a black market, who knows what kinds of bad handling people do and stuff like that. But also, it's just, and then there was someone who was selling a black market Impossible Burger on Amazon that we discovered by accident and shut them down too. And just this morning, we heard that there's a big, well-known company in Emeryville that is serving our burgers in their dining hall, and they apparently have a food store there, and they were selling it at retail in their food store, you know, which was, what? You know, anyway, blah, blah, blah. That's a bit of a tangent, but where can you buy it? It's served in quite a number of corporate cafeterias. It's at every Gott's roadside restaurant. It's at Umami Burger. It's at a bunch of sort of independent restaurants. Vina Inoteca at the Stanford Barn. Bucks. But a bunch of other little local restaurants. In San Francisco, there's probably at least a dozen places you can buy it. Oh, there's Umami Burger. There's Wahlburger. Those are in Palo Alto, downtown Palo Alto. I don't know, tons of places. You could go to our web if you're actually interested in finding out. You can go to our website, and we have a constantly updated list of where your nearest place is.
Well, I hear at the Public House at Giant Stadium, it's selling as well as the regular burgers.
Yeah, so the Public House is a really good example because that's not exactly, you know, like some vegetarian mecca, and that's a restaurant that's run by Tracy Desjardins, who's a dear friend and a wonderful person, and but it's a beer and burger joint, at the ballpark. And yeah, from day one, basically, there are 2 burgers on the menu. One is Neiman Ranch, cow-derived burger, and the other is an Impossible Burger. And since day one, they've been selling about equally. And actually, I had a funny experience with a BBC reporter a couple of months ago. I was talking to him in Public House, and he was like really, no offense, but he was really like snarky and kind of like, why am I even here? And kind of just, I think, to get, some gotcha kind of thing, he asked Tracy to bring him both burgers, the Impossible Burger and the Neiman Ranch Burger. And he was going to do the taste test and tell us which was which. And lo and behold, he did that. And he said our burger was the cow burger, and the other one was plant-based. So anyway, that was cool. And he had it on microphone, so I was pretty happy with that. I don't think he was too thrilled. But anyway.
So this is my last question, then I'll open it up to the audience. So what's next? There's steak, chicken, fish, pork, cheese, and the ultimate bacon.
Yeah. I'm not being evasive. Actually, I was just thinking the other day that what's the biggest difference between being in business and being in academia? And it dawned on me, actually, that what I think the biggest business is, in my old job, I never had to think about whether it was okay for me to share any facts that I knew. Like, it was an open book. You can ask me anything. I'll just give you what I think is the best answer. You can, we were very uncagey about our research work and progress and stuff like that. And I felt like life was simple because I'd get a question, I just answer it, and now in the business world, I'm just realizing that I have to actually keep track of, okay, I'm not supposed to say that, but anyway, this is not a case like that, though. Because we're actually trying to figure it out. We have a bunch of stuff that we are developing. We figured out some, so pretty much any animal meat flavor, we've got it, okay. The fundamental chemistry, it's different in important details, but it's all pretty much versions of the same thing, and you can create the different flavors. And fish is also very similar, turns out. Turns out that the flavor of fish, the flavor chemistry, is heme dependent. It's also catalyzed by heme. So fish, people don't think of fish as having much heme. Well, some sardines have as much heme as beef, and even fish that are, quote, white fish actually have quite a lot of heme. And it's critical to the flavor generation. It turns out that those long-chain polyunsaturated fats that are kind of the classic healthy fats in fish and stuff like that are precursors to some of the, in some of the flavor reactions that are catalyzed by heme that produce the fresh fish flavor and so forth. So anyway, so a lot of the, we've made tons of progress on the flavor chemistry. We're making a lot of progress on the texture, the kind of cuts of meat that have anatomy, like steak and stuff like that. From a sort of structural standpoint, are obviously significantly more complicated. But I'd say we have a lot of pretty good ideas about how to build those in. And so what's really going to be determining is, first of all, when do we feel like we have the bandwidth to launch a new product in terms of commercialization and so forth? Because we're just kind of going full speed ahead, just trying to scale up the product that we have, and we'd just be competing against ourselves doing that. But I think that we will have the choice when we're ready to launch a next product of chicken, fish, pork. We haven't tried bacon. That's an interesting one, because I think from a symbolic standpoint, it would be really important. From an environmental impact and market standpoint, it would be relatively low yield. So it hasn't been. It's kind of like every now and then someone who's like a true bacon nut, you know, has a conversation with me, and I'm thinking, all right, maybe we should just do it, just for the psychological impact. But anyway, it's probably not going to be on our immediate list, no. And we're also working on cheeses and stuff like that.